they swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally have attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie, we're looking at the military orders and the Crusades. Today we're going to tackle the Cathars, the Albigensians. Jamie, when was the last time you met an Albigensian? Let's find out about them.
Well, I'm told that there are some coming back to these days, and if you go to the south of France where they originated, their sites have been turned into tourist sites. But perhaps as we go along we'll see why that might be the case. One of the things we have to remember, we've looked at the military religious orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, and I think probably most people could readily see there's something noble in the ideal of the wealthiest, the richest, the most powerful people in Christian Europe serving the poorest of the poor, as the Knights Hospitallers did with their vocation, their hospitaller vocation. But what people find hard to reconcile is this vision, which is so easily associated with good things, the sort of things that Mother Teresa and her nuns do, with the suppression of heterodox sects. It's perhaps understandable to defend Christendom from invasions by forces like the forces of Islam and the Muslim raiders, the Barbary pirates, the huge armies that invaded Western Europe and Eastern Europe and the Holy Land. But what about within Christian society itself, where a crusade effectively is declared against a group that are, on the face of it, nothing more than dissidents? Well, if that was so, it would be plainly something that was unjust and unfair and rightly open to criticism. But what one has to think of to understand what really was going on was to recognize that heterodoxy is rather like we view, for example, Nazism or communism. That is to say, a very terrible alien ideology that causes tremendous harm, suffering and damage to humanity as a whole, and particularly to civilization. Now, of course, people will say, well, how is there a comparison? Well, we'll come to that. But if one sees the heterodox sects in that light, then you begin to understand the actions and activities of the Crusaders, the Church, and the Christian leaders of that time. And when we're dealing with the Albigensian Crusade, we're dealing with a group called the Cathars. Now, we've seen already that Spain was conquered by Islam, that lots of parts of France, southern France, for a long time lay under Muslim domination. So throughout, because this was for such a long period, and throughout that period, you began to see a weakening of Christian faith among the inhabitants, who were influenced by ideas coming from the Far East. And one of these ideas was to bear fruit, if that's the right expression, in Catharism. Actually, Catharism is a very old philosophy. It's post-Christian, but much older than the Albigensian times, and begins with a Persian or Parthian philosopher called Mani, whose philosophy was later called Manichaeism. And if you remember, St. Augustine, before he converted to Catholicism, was a Manichae. And this group and its philosophy of Manichaeism continued to spring up from time to time throughout Christian Europe, and it sprung up again in the 12th and 13th centuries, and earlier indeed in southern France and northern Spain. And these were the Cathari.
And the word somehow has connotations, doesn't the origin of the word mean purity? They think they're being very pure, same name as Catherine and so on. But it managed to attract people in a very fanatical way. Again, perhaps we're looking at the kind of sacrifice and dedication that the brown shirts gave to Nazism or communist groups give. It can really capture particularly young people and make them think this is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that matters. Nothing else matters at all.
Yes, I mean, I think one can carry the analogy too far. But I think it does at least give you an understanding of how people in the Middle Ages understood these groups. Now, if the Cathari were a slightly bizarre but peaceful sect, then again one would have to criticize any physical attack on the integrity of that group. But the simple historical reality is that they were far from peaceful, and that they were... there are extant records of them persecuting Catholics within their domains, and they did have domains because King Pedro of Aragon was a Cathar, Count Raymond of Toulouse was a Cathar, an Albigensian, or at least he was favourable to them. Whether his personal beliefs entirely accorded is not known. And they masqueraded as Christians, as Catholics, whilst believing some very odd and very strange things. But more importantly, they were a threat to public peace. They murdered Catholics. They persecuted them. And even eventually, when missionaries were sent to convert them, they murdered the missionaries, and ultimately, when a diplomatic mission was sent by the Pope, they murdered the papal legate. Now, once you start to see that, you begin to understand why the Christians who lived within their domains and next door were a little bit concerned about their security and safety, and ultimately felt the need to defend themselves with an armed force.
Now, this idea, then, of their weird beliefs, they really did have weird beliefs. They had this concept of good and evil and matter and spirit, very, very contrary to the Christian idea of this incarnational, we are body and soul all together.
I mean, Christianity has an idea of spirit and matter and of good and evil, of course, too. But where the Cathars differed is that they were dualists, and deriving from the philosophy of the Manichaees. They believed that the universe was created by an evil spirit, that there were two spirits of equal power, not God with a greater power and the devil having only derivative power, but two equal forces having equal power. One good force, one evil force. The good force was spiritual, the evil force was carnal, material, and the material world was created by the evil spirit, and therefore the material world was itself evil. And so it was evil to bring anything into that world, to enflesh or incarnate anything was evil. Well, that is plainly contrary to the most fundamental principles of Christianity. They believed, for instance, that to give birth to a child, to procreate, was evil, and marriage was therefore evil.
And if you follow that, it follows that other sexual activity is not evil. Recreational sex, of which we're only too familiar in our modern culture, is a positive good. And that obviously leads to a very gross idea about sex.
And you can understand, therefore, why there's a bit of a resurgence of interest in the Cathars today. Because in our own time, of course, we've seen that sort of philosophy, to some extent, being resurgent.
And they also had odd ideas on diet. I mean, they were vegetarian and so on.
Well,
and
they were vegetarian because they believed in reincarnation. They, rather like Buddhism, they believed that how you behave in this world determines what happens to you in the next world. There isn't this world, death, and then judgment, heaven or hell. There is a cycle of reincarnation, a very old pagan idea. And they believed, therefore, that animals were humans who'd come back in animal form, just the same as reincarnationists and Buddhists, for example, some Buddhists, do today. So therefore, they were not willing to cause any harm to animals, so they became vegetarians. Again, a view that has regained a certain amount of cachet in our own time.
And another one with echoes of today was their view about death. This idea that creation had been brought into being by something evil and meant that somehow death and even suicide and particularly euthanasia could be a good thing to do, and they had a rather ghastly idea that it was even a form of a sacrament.
Well, they only had one sacrament. It was called the consolamentum, and it consisted in euthanasia. You were either starved to death or you were suffocated to death, and this was their sacrament. So whilst one might say, well, they're vegetarians, there's no harm in that. Whilst they might say, well, they have a belief in dualism, well, as long as they have these strange beliefs but they don't harm anybody else, then, of course, they can be tolerated. But the minute they start to set up kingdoms, as in northern Spain or in Toulouse, and they use their power to persecute Catholics, to murder Catholics, or to murder and Jews as well, then you have to start to think about defending yourself from them. And it's clear that they have a very strange view of human life and the sanctity of human life if they have as their principal and only sacrament euthanasia, the death or the taking of life.
And so what was the Church's response? And who responded and in what measure? When, where?
It was initially dealt with by way of the medieval Inquisition, set up in 1184 by a papal bull ad abolendam to deal with the Cathars. And the Inquisition was meant to be a court system. Of course, the Inquisition, again, it's like the Crusades, has been given a very bad reputation, but the reality is that the Inquisition had very sophisticated legal procedures, often well in advance of the civil procedures in the civil courts. And the aim was, well, if these people are doing wrong deeds, if they're murdering, if they're killing, if they're, of course, the other things they were involved in was abortion and infanticide, because if they believed that marriage and childbirth were evil, then they believed that abortion and infanticide were not evil, and that is what they believed. Then these were infringements of the law and should be dealt with by a tribunal. So initially the Church attempted to deal with this by way of a tribunal, and this is the medieval Inquisition. That didn't prove sufficient, and many of the Cathars were very adept at avoiding conviction in the inquisitorial courts. And eventually, when they gained power in northern Spain and in southern France, they were able to harness the whole forces of the state, muster armies to conquer nearby Catholic dukedoms, principalities, counties, and baronies, and persecute Catholics. So this was an invasion force, effectively, within the bosom of Christendom itself. And remember, Christendom is being attacked from all sides. You know, we've got, first of all, the barbarians, we've got the Muslims, huge forces successfully sweeping through Christian lands. We have, as we'll discover later on, the pagan Lithuanians and Prussians. And now we have, within the bosom of Christianity itself, an invading force of people calling themselves Christians but actually persecuting Catholics.
And it was in a given geographical area. As you say, it happens to be an area which is now selling itself with this as a tourist phenomenon. But we are speaking of particular parts of France, so it was to some degree geographically.
Yes, they were centred on the city of Albi, or Albi, which is where they got their name, Albigeois in French, Albigensian, coming from the Latin. And that's why they're often called Albigensians. To think, effectively, one has to think of them in this way, because they were committing acts of violence and terror against their Catholic and Christian neighbours. They were effectively, many of them at any rate, a form of terrorist. Now, nobody complains today about the United States or the United Kingdom bringing into being a police force, anti-terrorist forces, homeland security, or courts to deal with terrorism, or laws to deal with terrorism. But for some reason, this is forbidden for medieval Christians. Now, when you look at it from that point of view, the criticism becomes absurd. So the real issue is, were the Cathars, did they hold these strange beliefs, and did they, in fact, behave as terrorists? Because once you see that they they were behaving as terrorists, then of course you've got to allow medieval Christian states to defend themselves from
Well,
this
come
terrorism.
on, you tell me.
So, a modern Cathar, pro-Cathar website has this to say about their beliefs. Because bear in mind, a lot of people will deny that the Cathars were Manichaeans. They will say that they were legitimately a form of Christianity. Well, here's what a modern pro-Cathar website says about their beliefs. Cathars believed in two principles, a good creator god and his evil adversary. Cathars maintained a church hierarchy and practiced a range of ceremonies, but rejected any idea of priesthood or the use of buildings, church buildings. They divided into ordinary believers who led ordinary medieval lives and an inner elect of parfait, the perfecti, the perfect ones. They believed in reincarnation and they refused to eat meat or other animal products. Basic Cathar tenets led to some surprising implications, and this is a pro-Cathar website. For example, they had no doctrinal objection to contraception, abortion, euthanasia or suicide. In some respects, the Cathar and Catholic churches were polar opposites. The Catholic Church taught and teaches still the opposite of their view. Following their principles, Cathars could deduce that sexual intercourse between man and wife was more culpable than, for example, sodomy. They also believed, as we've seen, in the principles of euthanasia. Now that tells a little bit about their beliefs. So we can see confirmation of their beliefs. But what about their activities? Well, here's what a contemporary, a Cistercian monk, Reinaldus, wrote about them at the time. For it is known that the Cathars held there are two creators, one of invisible things whom they call the benevolent God, and another of visible things whom they call the malevolent God. The New Testament they attribute to the benevolent God, the Old Testament to the malevolent God. They charge the author of the Old Testament with falsehood. They call also this God a homicide because he burned Sodom and Gomorrah and destroyed the world by a flood, as he also overwhelmed Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They affirmed also that the fathers of the Old Testament were damned, that St. John the Baptist was one of the greater demons. They said also in their secret doctrine that Christ was born in the visible and terrestrial Bethlehem and crucified in Jerusalem, was a bad man, and that Mary Magdalene was his concubine. Again, we see this renewed in the ideas brought up in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. For the good Christ, they said, never ate nor drank, nor took upon him true flesh, nor ever was in this world, except spiritually, in the body of St. Paul, interestingly. They said that almost all of the Church of Rome was a den of thieves, and that it was the harlot of which we read in the Apocalypse, which, by the way, is where the early Protestants got that idea from. Confirmation and confession they considered as altogether frivolous and vain. They preached that holy matrimony was meretricious and none that could be saved in it, especially if they begot children. Those who were called perfecti, perfect, wore a black dress, falsely pretended to chastity, abhorring the eating of flesh, eggs and cheese, and wished to appear not liars, when they were continually telling lies, chiefly respecting God. Those who were called believers were given to usury, rape, homicide, perjury, and every vice. In fact, they sinned with more security and less restraint because they believed that without restitution, without confession and penance, they would be saved, if only, when on the point of death, they received imposition of hands from their teachers, and it said a paternoster. So, here they have a belief that whatever they do, they're going to be saved, provided they fulfill a little ceremony before their death and undertake the consolamentum. So if they murder Catholics, if they commit rapes, robberies, and other crimes, and homicides, then they'll be saved. So you can see this is a system of belief which is liable to cause considerable antisocial disruption.
In the tackling the Cathars, the church has often been described as having a crusade. Well, as we've discussed earlier, this is a word we tend to use now, wasn't necessarily used at the time. But this didn't produce a particular military religious order, did it, the campaign against the Cathars?
No, but the military religious orders were involved. The Cathars themselves were in the habit of burning Catholic churches, and when missionaries were sent in to try and persuade them to moderate their behaviour, they murdered the missionaries. So the military religious orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, had to go in to protect the missionaries. This, of course, is another one of the roles of a Christian knight, and particularly the religious military orders, is to protect missionaries from this kind of violence. and so they did. And you see also at this time the foundation of the Dominican order, which was an order set up, an order of preachers, that's what they're still called, set up specifically to preach to the Albigensians. And St. Dominic, himself a Spaniard from the Guzman family, founded his order in order to preach to the Cathars. Now, as we've seen, the Cathars would not be preached to. They continued their terrorist activities against Christian settlements, and in the end they murdered the papal legate. And it was at that point that Pope Innocent III realized that he would have to deal with this problem in a manner involving force, police force, military force, and he declared a crusade. But even so, he couldn't raise enough volunteers to fight, and only a very small crusading army could be raised against the Cathars. The Cathars, on the other hand, having states in southern France and northern Spain, had very substantial armies under King Pedro and Count Raymond of Toulouse. And when the crusading army eventually met them at Muret in the south of France, they were tiny in comparison with this huge Cathar army of, it is said, in excess of 50,000 troops. The order of preachers, the Dominicans, prayed the rosary for the success of the crusading campaign, but it looked as if it was a foregone conclusion. It looked as if the Cathars were simply going to wipe out the crusading army. But on the 12th of September, significantly, 1213, at the Battle of Muret, the Crusader leader, Count Simon de Montfort, who was, by the way, the father of the founder of the English Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, stood up to this Cathar army with only 700 armed knights. He charged the centre of the Cathar army, and King Pedro was slain, and several other of the leaders of the Cathar army, which caused such consternation in the Cathar army that they were routed and they fled. By the way, Count Simon was deeply distressed at the death of King Pedro, because he had known King Pedro as a friend, and wept over his dead body. But having said that, if he had not been slain, it's quite possible that this tiny force of crusaders might have been defeated. And it was then, and at that battle, that miraculous battle, some say achieved by the prayers of the Dominicans, led by St. Dominic, praying the rosary in the church in nearby Muret, that the Cathars would have spread and perhaps taken over the whole of France, and who knows, yet further. But because of that miraculous victory, they were stopped in their tracks, and eventually the Cathar threat was gradually contained, and eventually order and peace was restored to that part of France and Spain.
What happened to the captured Cathars? I mean, were they converted, imprisoned? What happened?
Well, one learns about the Cathars from the great Inquisitor Bernard Guy, who wrote a treatise about the Cathars, as well as a number of legal textbooks which have had an influence on the development of law in Western Europe. And it becomes quite clear as you read about how he attempted firstly to convert them and then to deal with them by legal means, by the means of tribunals rather than by means of a crusade or a war, that they were very difficult people to deal with. They wouldn't take oaths, and that was the only way that they could be caught out, but they were perfectly happy to tell any number of lies to a tribunal and to avoid any kind of justice for their terrorist crimes by so doing. And it becomes quite clear as you read on that it was almost inevitable that they would have to be dealt with by some kind of policing force, which is what ultimately the Crusader, the Albigensian Crusade was about. But let us not forget that the Cathar army was a very substantial army, and the crusading army was a tiny one.
And it was this that popularised in the sort of Catholic idea the Rosary and St. Dominic, and generations of Catholic children have been taught about St. Dominic and the Rosary, and I certainly remember being told by at school and have passed on in my own teaching as well. Oh, well, you know, it was against the Albigensian heresy, but we never really went into what the Albigensian heresy was. Possibly a pity. It's a kind of rather lugubrious thing that children would enjoy reading about these perfectly awful people, so perhaps Catholic schools should teach
I agree,
more detail.
and I think we also they ought to be telling the full story. One so often hears of because you've got Catholic kings and because you've got a pope, it looks as if you have permanent control over the whole of Europe, both in terms of spiritually and physically. It just simply wasn't like that. You had a constant battle to maintain order and to protect individuals from groups like the Cathari who were bent upon effectively terrorist acts. And counter-terrorism was not an easy thing in those days, and raising an armed force to be able to deal with such terrorism was by no means easy. I
think there's always been also a tradition in the church, don't teach too much about the heresy, why bother to tell everybody what it was all about, and particularly with children. You just go, it's given a name, but it's important to put flesh on the name, and that's what succeeded in doing today. So this was a crusade that was well within the borders of Europe, and again with places that we can visit today and a saint that we can find out about, and also the great religious order, the Dominicans, were only too happy to continue their work, and we'll talk about St. Dominic. So we've learned a whole lot today that was in a rather different category from some of the other military campaigns. We've been looking at the military orders and the Crusades. Join us in the next episode when we learn more about the Templars, from the Holy Land to their destruction of the Templar Order.